Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. Welcome to the fourth lesson of our fall Bible study series. As always, we ask that you share this video with family and friends, anyone you care about. You feel like this may be helpful to them. If you're watching at Wednesdays or at 12 or 6:30, we're live on Facebook, live on YouTube, and Dialpad meetings. If the persons you are connected to are on the go, they can listen. They can just call in 804-203-9011. All right, let's get started with week 4. If this is your first time joining us, we are using Dr. Obery Hendricks' book, The Politics of Jesus, as our guide. Week 1, we dealt with treating the people's needs as holy, which, as and you should be able to see, is the foundation for Jesus's life and for Jesus's ministry. Week 2, we looked at a second strategy, which encouraged us to give a voice to those who may be voiceless. And then last week, which was week 3, we considered the third strategy, which was empowering people, empowering us to expose the workings of oppression. Today, the fourth strategy is entitled Call the Demon by Name. Call the Demon by Name. Our focal text is Mark 5, and if you've been around 6 Mount Zion for some years, you'll remember Deacon Richard Tompkins, one of our deacons, portraying one of the characters in the story during an illustrated sermon that I preached a long time ago, called Extreme Makeover, the God Edition, which there's a 13-year-old clip of it actually on our YouTube page. And when we did the Mark version of the whip, the hammer, and the cross as well. Listen to Mark 5th chapter, verses 1 through 10 from the New International Version.
They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart, and he broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice,
What do you want of me, Jesus? Son of the Most High God, in God's name, don't torture me.
When Jesus had said to him,
"Come out of this man, you evil spirit."
Then Jesus asked him,
"What is your name?"
My name is Legion. We are many.
and he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area.
Like most of the passages we've considered over the past few weeks, this particular Bible story is almost universally understood to be an account of a healing, more specifically an exorcism of a man who was engaging in self-harm and other destructive behaviors. Mark tells us that the cause of the man's madness is possession by a demon, also referred to as an unclean spirit. Dr. Hendricks acknowledges that this understanding of Mark 5th chapter verses 1 through 13 is pretty much self-evident, except for one small detail. He notes that the unclean spirit does not ask Jesus not to send him out of the man. No, the unclean spirit asks Jesus not to send them out of the country. Now, why is this significant, you ask? Because as we look at these texts through a public theology perspective, we will see that it is possible that the man in Mark 5 is not an individual man at all, but a representative character meant to stand for the country or the people of Israel. And if the man represents the inhabitants of Israel, then the unclean spirit that has possessed the people and caused self-destructive chaos among them is not an individual demon, but also a collective presence. This leads us to ask, who or what was that collective demonic presence that had possessed the country? In the text, the demon identifies itself as Legion. And you remember this, for we are many. At the time that Jesus lived, Legion wasn't necessarily a man's name. A legion referred to the powerful and brutal Roman army, which had in fact occupied Israel. According to History.com, a Roman legion typically had between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers. So what at first glance seems to be an account of an exorcism, when we take a closer look, it turns out to be a parable indicting the Roman military for its role in the upheaval that was devastating the social fabric of Israel. Mark's description of his country as having gone wild with self-destruction corresponds to the reality of his situation. First century Israel was indeed a country beset by an unclean spirit that expressed itself through a number of extreme social conditions. There are numerous references in the gospel to insanity, depression, dejection, dispossessed farmers, enslaved debt defaulters, diseased beggars, and revolutionary upheavals. Dr. Hendricks suggests that this story in Mark 5 depicts a society that in many ways appeared to be coming apart at the seams. Adding to the chaos was, as we learned in the second strategy, that Israel's ruling class, principally the Jerusalem priesthood, participated in the dispossession and financial ruin of their own people by helping Israel's Roman overlords collect taxes set at very burdensome levels. This in addition to the taxes and the dues extracted by the temple hierarchy itself. These actions by the authorities triggered uprisings among the most desperate, and it caused tension with those unwilling to risk the torture and execution that awaited failed rebels. Now, another factor was, on the one hand, a pervasive feeling of powerlessness among the people to resist Roman power in any of its forms, and on the other hand, a tendency to blame themselves for the condition of their lives as God's judgment for their moral failings. Taken together, these factors reflect a society in the process of self-destruction. So I say again, although on one level, Mark 5 verses 1 through 13 is an account of an exorcism, on another level, it is a radical political parable in the guise of a healing story, a parable that tells the people that it is not God's displeasure that has afflicted them, but the misdeeds of those who lord it over them. That is the reason that Jesus tells this powerful parable, to free the people from self-blame by helping them to identify the real causes of their problems. He reminds them that although ultimately they are responsible for their own lives and their own accomplishments, the wretchedness of their plight is not the result of irresponsibility or laziness or some inherent failing of their own. Rather, it is the result of being exploited and the maltreatment by those who rule them. And so Jesus reminds the people that they've been abused, that they've been sinned against, that they've been victimized by those whom the fruits of their labor have so greatly enriched. He helps them to understand the circumstances are as they are not because there is something wrong with them, but because there is something wrong with those who oppress them. Jesus does not soften his explanation with euphemisms or polite descriptions. He does not try to qualify his words or make them more palatable by giving them balance or by citing mistakes that the people have made. He wants his points to be fully clear. So he calls the Roman military presence in Israel exactly what it has proven to be to his people: a destructive, demonic, unclean presence. Dr. Hendricks states that, quote, in perfect prophetic fashion, Jesus calls the demon to be known by his name, unquote. He speaks as a prophet should speak, boldly and on point, identifying the demon in no uncertain terms. He blames the people's plight, not on the victimized, but on the victimizer, the Roman legions. He cuts through all excuses and explanations to tell the people the unvarnished truth. But it is not enough to help people identify the source of their problems. They must also be helped to see that they have the power to solve their problems. So Jesus' parable illustrates that the people can break the demonic chains that bind them if they stop relinquishing their power through self-defeating attitudes and behaviors that will impact them. Mark supports Jesus' point by demystifying the power of the Romans. What Jesus' response in Mark 5 tells us is that in our quest to treat the people's needs as holy, we must be boldly prophetic. That is to say that we too must bring to light the identity of the demons that cause the people's suffering. It's true that no one, whether rich or poor, strong or weak, should ever be absolved of responsibility for his or her own actions. And it is important that those in need be counseled to do as much as they can to help themselves. But it is more than important. It is our sacred prophetic duty to identify and call by name the policies, the governmental officials, the corporate officers, the events, the developments, the greedy elites that are responsible for the impoverishment of the people. Calling the demon by name is an integral part of our Christ-like call to treat the people's needs as holy. Thus, we must call by name every factor, every condition, or person that does not treat the people's needs as holy. To paint this picture, Dr. Hendricks lifts up the deadliest natural disaster up until the point that the book was published. On August 29, 2005, one of the most powerful and destructive storms ever to hit the United States struck the Gulf Coast. Hardest hit was the city of New Orleans, most of which sat on land that was below sea level. When the storm destroyed a system of protective levees, 80% of the city found itself underwater. The city's sewage, clean water, transportation infrastructures were destroyed, along with some 200,000 homes in the greater New Orleans area. Although hundreds of thousands of New Orleans residents fled as the storm approached, an estimated 100,000 stayed behind, most because they were either too poor or too sick to leave, or they just had nowhere else to go. More than 1,000 of these New Orleans were killed, and tens of thousands were rendered homeless by the storm's destruction. By any measure, Hurricane Katrina was one of the most catastrophic events to hit American soils. But what followed made a terrible situation absolutely shameful. A horrified nation watched as those in New Orleans who had survived Katrina were then forced to endure hunger and thirst and decomposing corpse in their midst, exposure to withering heat day after day, and lack of even the most basic medical care while awaiting rescue. If you remember, then President George W. Bush did a flyover instead of getting on the ground so that the people would know that they were not forgotten. For reasons that still don't make sense, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, did not arrive in New Orleans until days after the storm had passed. By then, oppressive conditions had become insufferable and absolutely inhumane. Most survivors had not had food or water since the levees broke. And so I just want you to envision, though we are talking about Hurricane Katrina, we'll go back to that in a second, right now, over the past couple of weeks, hundreds of people have died, even in Hurricane Helene, all up and down the East Coast, primarily in southern states, but even some impacted here in Virginia. But we've seen this reenacted over several decades, where we have these huge storms. I'm reading a book right now that, reminded us of, I think, Hurricane Gaston or Tropical Storm Ernesto that dumped millions of gallons of water into Chaco. That's the part that we remember, but most of us don't focus on the fact that those same incidents dropped water into Battery Park and filled up tennis courts and basketball courts, and sewer lines backed up, and community persons a lot of people lost their homes. The water was contaminated, bad smells. Generally, the poor, those who are disenfranchised, are always the ones who are hurt the worst in these situations. So we're talking about Katrina, and many of us remember Katrina. Spike Lee probably did one of the most provocative documentaries when the levees broke on Hurricane Katrina. But if you can't connect to that, then I just want you to think about recent histories. Think about what you've been watching on TV for the past couple weeks. Now, we record this on Friday. Hopefully by the time we play this today, the situation has gotten better. So back to Katrina. As the nation watched the unfolding of the scenario in New Orleans, some influential conservative journalists, some right-wing pundits, demonized the hurricane's victims by blaming them for causing their own suffering, rather than asking why so many Americans were left to endure so much for so long without even the most basic of federal assistance. They chose to place the blame for the horrendous treatment of the suffering poor in New Orleans squarely on their own backs. After televised images made it clear that most of the storm's victims were poor radio personalities like Rush Limbaugh at the time admitted the possibility that many of those stranded in the city were unable to flee the storm because they were too poor to own cars. Yet, he still managed to fault the underprivileged people of New Orleans for their own plight. Quote Rush Limbaugh.
So if you're going to say the press isn't responding or isn't reporting the nature of the survivors and the dead, and that they are mostly black and mostly poor, because there's an inert racism here and a fear of political correctness or whatever, well, let's explain why that might be. 67% of the population of New Orleans is black, and so the odds are that the sufferers and the people harmed by this are going to be black. And by the way, all these areas are wiped out. The non-black population was just as devastated, but apparently they were able to get out, and the black population wasn't able to get out. Maybe New Orleans has a half-decent mass transit system, and some of these people don't need cars. But no, Rush, that's you're glossing over. They can't afford cars. Well, why is that? Why can't they afford them? What is it about New Orleans that doesn't pay? It's a 67% black population, lots of black-run businesses. Why is it they don't pay well, though?
The former Fox News host, Bill O'Reilly, demonized the impoverished hurricane victims as drug users, saying, this is Bill O'Reilly, quote, many of the poor in New Orleans weren't going to leave no matter what we did. They were drug addicted. They weren't going to get turned off from their source. They were thugs, whatever. Every American kid should be required to watch videotape of the poor in New Orleans and see how they suffered because they couldn't get out of town. And then every teacher should tell the students, if you refuse to learn, listen to this, y'all. If you refuse to work hard, if you become addicted, if you live a gangster lifestyle, you will be poor and powerless, just like many of those in New Orleans, unquote. Even crazier, he suggested that a lot of the people who stayed simply wanted to destroy the city. And he wondered why, quote, looters, unquote, were not being shot on sight. And unfortunately, it wasn't just talk show hosts. In the aftermath of Katrina, many fundamentalist Christians hailed the storm as divine judgment on New Orleans for its moral transgressions. Rick Warren, the great author, when we were buying up his books, The Purpose-Driven Church, Purpose-Driven Life, made him rich, encouraged those affected, listen, quote, to play it down and pray it up, unquote. Even Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who was seen shopping in New York at the Ferragamo shoe store and spending several $1,000s worth of shoes, failed to see how those impacted by Katrina were neglected. A reporter posed this question. You've spoken very eloquent around the world about growing up as a black woman in the South. Are you concerned now that at least the impression is going to exist in this country and abroad that some of the relief has been affected by the race and class of the people most affected? Unquote. Condoleezza Rice, the African-American Secretary of State, responded, quote, that Americans would somehow, in a color-affected way, decide who to help and who not to help. I just don't believe it, unquote. In the meantime, the Homeland Security Chief and the head of FEMA, those who were primarily charged with rescuing the storm survivors, tried to explain away their agency's badly delayed response to the horrific conditions by attributing it to bureaucratic snafus and negligence on the part of the state and local officials, even as more stranded survivors perished from the government's neglect. At the time, the mayor, man, you can see Ray Nagin, he was on TV begging for federal help. I never forget President Bush publicly praised the FEMA chief as doing it.
Again, I want to thank you all for, and Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director is working 24
Bush even claimed that no one had anticipated the breach of the levees, despite years of public studies and reports as recent as one day prior to the hurricane's landing, that the levees could not protect the city from a major storm. And despite urgent warnings by government meteorologists that Hurricane Katrina would be one of the worst storms this nation had ever seen. In the news media, sensationalized reports were issued in print and on the air that made the hurricane victims look more like misfits and criminals than the law-abiding taxpayers that most were. Reporters claimed that the city was overwhelmed with armed gangs and large-scale shootouts. There were accounts of rapes and even murders at the convention center and the Superdome, where tens of thousands of survivors were warehoused. Those reports were later found to be false. In fact, after everyone was evacuated from the convention center and the Superdome, New Orleans police superintendent admitted that there were no official reports to document of any rape, any murder, any sexual assault. Unfortunately, the residue of these false portrayals of the hurricane victims lingered. The people of New Orleans were demonized, while news reports failed to explain that some of the residents acted out of desperation. Think about that. Folk right now, I'm watching, where I was last week when we recorded this, Good Morning America, the NBC News show, Channel 6. I mean, these folk right now, these are people in Asheville, North Carolina. These are people in Georgia, desperate, begging for help They hungry, they thirsty. One dude was talking about his mother with his dad sitting right there beside him. His mother got swept up in the water and got drugged down, into the high waters. These folk were thirsty. They were starving. They were on rooftops. I'm telling you, go back and watch that Spike Lee documentary. I'll never forget that little boy in the they recording him. Little boy couldn't have been no more than 7, 8 years old, desperately begging for help.
We just need some help out here. It is so pitiful, and shame that all these people out of here, they have over 3,000 people out of here with no home, no shelter. What are they gonna do? What we gonna do? Take a look at all of this. Now what they gonna do if the hurricane come again? All us gonna be flooded. We don't have nowhere to go, nothing to eat. My grandmother is a diabetic. She's 76 years old. She out of her insulin. What she gonna do? She don't know if she gonna live or die. We all don't know what we gonna do. So we just need some help and support.
Still, videos will show with the words looting scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Even though in the storm's aftermath, most had not had food or water, and nearly all of them still had on the same filthy clothing they had worn for days. Thankfully, in the midst of these accusations, other voices spoke up about how it was not coincidental that so many of these trapped in the flooded city were poor. They realized that it was not laziness or drug addiction, but poverty. Many journalists refused to demonize the victims and commenced to acknowledge the role of economic deprivation in the tragedy. Now, you're going to hear some AI voices coming up. These are not the real people's voices. All right. So when you hear Lester Holt's name and you hear AI voice, you know that's not Lester Holt. All right. We're using AI, computerized voices. CNN's Paula Zane confronted FEMA Director Michael Brownie Brown on air saying,
"Sir, you said earlier today that part of the blame for what you think will be an enormous death toll in New Orleans rests with the people who did not evacuate the city, who didn't heed the warnings. Is that fair to blame the victims, many of whom tell us they had no way out, they had no cars of their own, and that public assistance wasn't provided to get them out early?"
In an interview with House Majority Leader Tom DeLay, MSNBC anchor Lester Holt asked,
"People are now beginning to voice what we've all been seeing with our own eyes. The majority of people left in New Orleans are black, they are poor, they are the underbelly of society. When you look at this, what does this say about where we are as a country and where our government is in terms of how it views the people of this country?"
When DeLay responded with, "We're doing a wonderful job and we are an incredibly compassionate people," Holt refused to back off, saying,
"Those people at the Superdome, those people at the convention center. They're largely black, and they're largely poor, and they're largely left behind. What does that say about our country right now and how it treats its citizens?"
Will Haygood declared in the Washington Post,
"To those who wonder why so many stayed behind when push came to water's mighty shove here, those who were trapped have a simple explanation. The nickels and dimes and dollar bills simply didn't add up to stage a quick evacuation."
Cynthia Tucker of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which I got a subscription with, wrote,
"The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, with its pathetic images of desperately poor people, mostly black people, stuck in New Orleans without food, water, or adequate shelter after all the affluent people had fled, should come as no surprise. This is a natural consequence of a political and social culture that has decreed, 'You're poor? Why would anyone want to be poor? Tough luck. You're on your own.'"
A number of elected officials spoke up as well. On ABC's This Week, then Senator Barack Obama said,
"What's true in this country is what's true across the world, which is in the midst of natural disasters, the poor and vulnerable end up getting hit the hardest." I mean, it's puzzling, given the president's immediate response during 9/11, that he did not feel a greater sense of empathy towards the folks that were experiencing this enormous disaster.
The late Congressman John Lewis wrote in Newsweek.
It's so strange that when we have something like this happening, the president gets two ex-presidents, his father and Bill Clinton, to raise money. What they propose to do is good, and I appreciate all the work the private sector and the faith-based community are doing. But when we get ready to go to war, we don't go around soliciting resources with a bucket or an offering plate. By next year, we'll have spent $400 to $500 billion in Afghanistan and Iraq. That money could be used to help rebuild the lives of people.
Some bravely noted the difference in media portrayals of similar behavior in blacks and whites. For instance, you probably remember Kanye West going off script during a televised fundraiser for the Red Cross. Went back and watched it, a minute and 40 seconds. He started off, he was going off script from the beginning. I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. If you see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And then he goes on for about another minute, a rant, and Michael Myers, I think, standing off to the side. And then they cut back to him, and he says,
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
And just threw everybody off. But Kanye was speaking his truth, and the truth is 20 years later, it's a whole bunch of colored people who still feel the same way, that the government and its representatives don't care about minority people in this country, particularly black people. What is significant here is that courageous men and women of diverse backgrounds and diverse professions stepped out on their own comfort zones to call the demon of callousness and uncaring and racial stereotyping by its real name. That is, they publicly disputed the false assertions of those in power, and they declared the real causes of the continued suffering of so many. They exposed the mean-spiritedness, the faulty logic, and the outright duplicity of those who blame the victims for their own pain. These men and women upheld Jesus' call to advocacy for the poor. They used their resources, they used their platforms to protect victims from being blamed from their own victimization. They identified the demon as lack of care for the poor and the purposeful, institutionally enforced impoverishment of America's most vulnerable. By raising their pens and their voices, they took the prophetic stance that Jesus calls all of us to take. Now, some of them may not see their actions in their light, but that is not the important thing. What matters is that when it truly counted, these voices of righteous indignation treated the people and their needs as holy. I've shared before that this book was published in 2007, and so much has changed since then. When the book came out, George W. Bush was president. We've since had 8 years of Barack Obama, 2 terms, 4 years of Donald Trump, and wrapping up with 4 years of President Joe Biden. In just a few weeks, we'll learn whether or not the United States of America will elect its first woman to hold the highest office in the land or not. As you prepare to vote for, if you've not already, I was encouraged Sunday before last when I asked how many people voted. It looked like probably 30 to 50% of our congregation have already voted. But if you haven't, and you go to the polls, and if you're in Richmond, you got several things you're voting for. Everybody else, you're voting primarily for federal candidates. But if you're voting for school board, city council, mayor, Congress persons, congressional seats, senators, president, vice president, make sure that you're taking into account those people who are giving voice to the voiceless, those who are speaking truth to power, those who are calling the demon out by name, you know, and just be smart. Just think through, you know. I mean, you repeatedly, you know, one of the candidates that you'll be voting for constantly is saying that the last time they ran for a federal election, they didn't lose. and they hype people up to storm the Capitol of the United States and then say that it was some good people and that it was a peaceful protest. Same person talking about good people with tiki torches down on a college campus, encouraging that, peaceful protests primarily. Not every protest was peaceful, but there was some peaceful protests, advocacy when George Floyd was choked to death on national TV 4 summers ago, and people want to see some change. And those people, President, I think at the time, President called them vile people that should be locked up. He was even encouraging people to shoot them. So, just think about the people who got a conscience, who care about human beings. That's what we want you to be focused on. So, in this book, as I head toward the finish line, Hendricks lays out what he sees as problems in society.
We must call all the callous and uncaring practices and policies, the betrayals of trust, and the exploitation of weakness and despair what they really are. Evil. Not just politics, not just neglect, not just thoughtlessness, not even gross selfishness, but evil. If anyone hurts others, limits their life chances, or denies them the fullest fruits of life for the sole purpose of enriching himself and those he counts as his own, by biblical definition, this is evil. We must call by name tax laws that favor the interests of the rich, evil. We must call by name corporate boards and executives who underpay their workers while giving corporate executives annual salaries and bonuses so large that it would take the average worker centuries of labor to earn as much, evil. We must call by name those who claim to hold the people's needs as holy, but in reality do not, evil. We must call evil by name to remind the people that public officials are supposed to be public servants, and remind public servants that it is the welfare of the many that they are to serve, not the whims and wants of the privileged few. We must call the demon by name in our churches, call by name ministers' crass materialism and their lack of prophetic engagement, must call by name their collusion with forces that exploit and oppress those whom they are supposed to serve. We must call by name the perversion of Jesus' gospel by prosperity preachers who blame the people for their sickness and poverty instead of decrying the demonic mistreatment of the poor by those who hold only their own needs as holy. We must call evil by name when pensions are squandered, when Americans are dispossessed of their livelihoods by greedy executives who export American jobs to regions where they can better exploit workers' desperation.
As we prepared to teach this strategy, I thought about some of the things we see now that could be considered evil. All right, villainizing legal migrants for political points. Actually talking about going up and scooping, and just think about how simple that sounds. I mean, just one of the candidates now talking about mass deportation. Just think about the chaos that's going to cause. It's plain evil. Suggesting that we accept school shootings as a fact of life, and rather than enact common sense gun laws. We promise, or these people, these leaders promise more armed police with stronger windows and doors. Just evil. Standing by your call for the death penalty for young men of color who were wrongfully convicted for a crime, even after DNA proves that they were innocent. Evil. Proposing that working parents depend on their parents to help watch their children rather than work to reduce the cost of child care. Just evil. Calling your opponents, political opponents, derogatory insults. And that's just one of, I've been doing barbershop talks. And that's one of the things that I start off with. Like, just think about what these folk are saying, particularly about black women. Like, just straight up not calling somebody their name the right way. It's just insulting. Telling somebody, just saying somebody got mental issues, born that way. Just derogatory insults and proposing they be punished simply for disagreeing with you. It's evil. Forcing women to have children they cannot afford, or that it's going to put their life at risk. Just evil. And then not passing the legislation to help them financially. It's evil. A hungry child in the land of plenty is evil. Elders facing the last years of their lives without pension, health care, secure housing, respectful treatment. You know, I'm dealing with this with some of the elders in my family right now. Pretty much the government won't help you if you're a senior unless you have absolutely nothing. You got to work your whole life and you got to give it all. You got to spend it all the way down, give it all the way up before the government tries to help you with some health care. It's just wrong. Evil. Upsetting the status quo by championing the people's needs might cause some to shy away for fear of a backlash and further repression by those in power. Yet calling the demon by name is an undeniable responsibility of those who seek to truly follow Jesus. Jesus' triumph over the unclean spirit in Mark 5 teaches that when properly used, the power of Jesus' gospel can liberate societies from the grip of oppression. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody will like it when we speak out against evil. Because when you look at the text, just a few verses later, the people were so upset by the legion being sent out that they rejected Jesus and sent Jesus away. They began to beg Jesus to leave. Verse 17 tells us. In other words, they allowed their feelings of powerlessness to deny them the power of Jesus' prophetic witness. As a result, they remained enthralled to the whims and will of the Roman military and subject to the destructiveness of its unclean spirit. We who profess to follow the journey of Jesus, the politics of Jesus, must not let fear or apathy have the last word. When we call the demon by name, some of us will be asked to take our message somewhere else, or to soften the names that we call out loud, whisper them. We must not. We who profess to follow Jesus must continually ask God for the strength to call the demon by name and then speak it. Amen. That concludes today's Bible study. I hope you share this video and then come back next week when we'll talk about the fifth political strategy that impacted Jesus' life and ministry. As we get ready for After Bible Study Chat, you can get there 3 different ways. Download the Dialpad meeting app, or go to your browser, go to meetings.dialpad.com/SMCBC, or call 804-203-9011. All right, let's go on over to the After Bible Study Chat.